Dear friends, Science and Religion is an interdisciplinary course at BD level in all our seminaries which are affiliated to the Senate of Serampore College. Senate of Serampore College organized a refresher course for all the seminary teachers who are taking this particular course at UTC, United Theological College, Bangalore, in the first week of December. 3 wise men from the West came to Bangalore to enlighten us in this refresher course. They are Professor Dr. Denis Alexander and Professor Dr. Russel Cowburn from England and Professor Dr. John H. Walton from the USA. Denis Alexander is an emeritus professor of Cambridge and emeritus director of Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. He has published a lot of books concerning science and religion, interaction and dialogue. Are we slaves to our genes? Creation or evolution? Do we have to choose? Rebuilding the Matrix are just a few of his widely acclaimed books. Russel Cowburn is currently a professor of Cambridge. He is a member of the prestigious Royal Society of England. He has got more than 60 patents in his name. John H. Walton is a famous Christian theologian, especially an Old Testament scholar. The lost world of Genesis 1, the lost world of Adam and Eve, Bible background commentary are just a few of his very famous works. All these scholars have contributed tremendously to the science and religion studies. They are frequently invited resource persons in international conferences. We are really privileged to have them in our midst. With the curiosity of a child, I am trying to ask them a few simple questions so that their answers may be enlightening our children and our youngsters. We are really privileged to have these great scholars and professors who have come here in Bangalore to enlighten the theological teachers with regard to science and religion. After listening to your talks and wonderful enlightening sessions, I thought of having a discussion with you so that this sharing will be enlightening our children and youngsters. I know that after marathon talks and discussions and travels you are tired, but still you are sparing your valuable time to enlighten us, and we are very much grateful to each one of you. Professor Denis Alexander, usually there is a myth that Charles Darwin is an atheist and his works and his attempt was to attack Christianity and religious faith, but reality is different. How would you explain that, respond to that?
So Charles Darwin came to my university, Cambridge University, to study, He actually originally went to Edinburgh University to study medicine, but he didn't like that at all. So his father sent him to Cambridge University to study classics and divinity, and the aim was that he should become ordained in the Church of England. And he came as a believer in God and in the Christian faith to Cambridge, but then later on he went on a great voyage on the Beagle, his ship, all the way around the world, and he gave up the idea of being ordained in the Church of England, and he had a family. He married a lovely Christian believer as his wife, and called Emma. But later on, he lost his active Christian faith. But the reason was not because of science, or it was not because of evolution. It was because of suffering, and he had seen suffering in his own family, especially his little girl Annie, who died at the age of 12, and that was a great sorrow to Darwin. He couldn't explain that, why that had happened, and so he became agnostic. And the word agnostic was invented. It was always he always said you can believe in evolution and you can be an ardent theist, meaning you can be a very passionate believer in God and you can still believe in evolution. But in his own lifetime, he lost his active Christian faith, which was sad, but through suffering.
In our personal conversation, you said something about the new book which is getting published recently about faith coming through Richard Dawkins. That seems to be very strange and interesting. Can you say something about that?
Yes, so the book is called Coming to Faith through Dawkins, and it's a book of 12 essays by 12 different authors coming from 5 different countries, and they all have something in common. They all started life as an atheist or agnostic, and they had no interest in religion, or they were anti-religious until they started reading the writings of Richard Dawkins, this famous atheist from Oxford, and also the writings of the other so-called new atheists, people like Christopher Hitchens, who's now died, but who lived in America at the end of his life. And when they started reading the writings of Richard Dawkins, they were very shocked. They were coming to his writings as atheists, but they discovered he was very bitter, and his writings about religion were very different from his writings about biology and so forth. So, and that really was the trigger that led them to explore Christian faith seriously for themselves. And then, over a period of time, they came to Christian faith. And these 12 essays describe how they came to Christian faith from these very different backgrounds. And the authors are from Australia, South Africa, Egypt, England, and America. So from very different cultural backgrounds, but all with this same experience of God using Dawkins in their life to bring them to faith in Christ.
Professor John Walton, from a literal point of view, many of our youngsters ask a question about the Adam-Eve issue, whether they are the first human beings, whether Adam is a historical figure, and how can we interpret this creation story in the light of modern scientific discoveries?
Those are, of course, very complicated questions. I think it's most important to look at what the biblical text is doing with Adam and Eve. Are they interested in questions of biological origins? And I would say that no, they are not. They want us all to see ourselves in Adam and Eve. They want to help us to understand that we all are Adam and Eve. And so in that sense, we don't have to try to use the stories about Adam and Eve to try to understand scientific human origins. Rather, we can follow along with the text and take the message that it has for us.
You are an Old Testament scholar. In Old Testament, you know that there are a lot of references and passages which endorse violence in the name of God. Even now, such violence and wars are taking place in Israel and in Gaza. In olden days also, wars were taking place as encouraged and instructed by God. So how can we understand such passages in the light of Jesus Christ? There's a huge contradiction. How can we interpret it?
People today who are living under oppression, governments that are tyrannical and that are killing them, often have the question, where is God? Why doesn't he do something about my oppressors? In that sense, when people are suffering at the hands of a government or a body of wicked people, they're really looking for God to act on their behalf. And that may very well entail violence to overthrow an oppressive, persecuting regime. In a situation like that, we wouldn't blame God for being violent. We would rather say that he's doing justice. Sometimes in the Old Testament, those are the kinds of situations we face, where the violence that God participates in are very explicitly identified as acts of judgment, punishment against wickedness. And we should not be surprised that God would do that. There are other occasions where that punishment aspect is not as clear, and we wonder about what's God doing. For instance, we might think in terms of the Canaanites and Joshua's armies coming into the land. That's a very complicated situation because some of those Hebrew words that express to utterly destroy them, I believe, are mistranslations. That is, that they don't suggest that Israel should do that. So sometimes we have to look at the text more carefully because it's possible that we're misunderstanding it. But yet other times, God is carrying out justice. And that's no different in the New Testament. Jesus is a champion of justice. He's an advocate for justice. And he talks about the idea of God's punishment coming on the unjust. Certainly the book of Revelation portrays that kind of situation. So I don't think that we have to conclude that the New Testament and the Old Testament are at odds on this issue. When Jesus says to turn the other cheek, he's not talking about government not doing its job or being permissive of tyrannical governments. There are other issues at stake there that he's addressing in terms of our personal response to our enemies. So we have to be careful that we interpret well, that we read the Bible well, and that we see that there is some continuity between the testaments on this issue.
Thank you. Professor Russel Cowburn. Nowadays, many scientists are either atheists or agnostics, but still there are many who are strong believers also. You are faithful to your profession as a scientist. At the same time, you are maintaining very meaningfully your faithfulness to your calling and faith Can you explain it a little bit how you are beautifully integrating science and faith?
So I'm a physicist, and I've worked in different physics labs around the world for over 30 years now, and I've met all sorts of people in that time. And some of them that I've met are atheists, some of them aren't sure, and some are people of tremendous faith. So in effect, in science, you have all sorts of people, just as outside of science, you have all sorts of people. So I don't think there is anything in science itself that tells us that we must be atheist, because there are many faithful people who find it very straightforward, actually, to be professional scientists and also true to their faith at the same time. For those of us who are people of faith and also practicing scientists, and I include myself in that, it's a wonderful exploration of what God has done. As far as I'm concerned, science is about looking more closely at the works of the Creator. And therefore it's actually an act of praise and worship. So I think being a scientist and a Christian is a wonderful combination. I get to see God in action, both through the Bible and through Jesus, but also through the works of his creation, through the physical universe that I study as a physicist. And I actually think it's only when you really see both of those, that you see through the Bible and you see through the microscope, that you really get a true picture of the universe that we live in. Some people have talked about binocular vision. We need both eyes to be able to see. One eye looking at faith, the other eye looking at science.
Thank you. It means scientism is not essential for being a committed scientist, that materialistic worldview is not part of science. So we need to distinguish science and scientism.
We do. I mean, scientism is effectively the religion of science. So I'm not a scientismist in that regard. I'm a scientist, which means I enjoy looking at the material world, the physical world. But then when it comes to questions of who and why, I'm very happy to say, because of my creator God. Somebody who is a fervent believer in scientism would say you can't answer questions of who and why. You can only get information from scientists, from science. So I'm looking for a broader, more diverse set of information sources. I want to see what the Bible says. I want to see what I learn from my microscopes. And when I piece them together, I can truly see the whole world.
Okay. As a scientist as well as a believer, can you say something about the cause of Big Bang, which happened 13.8 billion years ago?
Well, science doesn't really have any answers to the question of the cause of the Big Bang. Science can tell us in great detail everything that happened immediately after the Big Bang, but science doesn't really have the tools to go beyond what we call the singularity, the beginning of the Big Bang. So I think science is relatively silent on that question, because that's a question of technical detail, and we just don't have the tools to answer that. But again, I want to say there are lots of questions about the world that I'm interested in. I'm interested in questions of what and when. These are the science questions, and I can learn about those in the lab. But I'm also interested in questions of who and why. And science doesn't really have the tools to answer those. And so for those I need to look elsewhere, namely to faith. And if I combine the two, I can answer what, when, who, and why. I can see a complete picture.
Okay, thank you. Last question. Now is the time for dinner, so we have to wind up. Professor Denis Alexander, you think that the question whether we should choose faith or evolution? That is a meaningless, foolish question. How do you explain theistic evolution as a solution to these kind of questions and issues?
Yes, the phrase theistic evolution is not suggesting a different kind of understanding of evolution from the standard biological theory of evolution. Theistic evolution simply is a reminder that those of us who are believers believe that God is the author of creation. And when we think about human authorship, we think about a book, the whole book. Maybe it's got 20 chapters, we read the whole book, and the whole book is written by one author. Now it might be that we understand chapter 2 and 3 quite well, we don't really understand chapter 4 very well, and so on. So we have different levels of understanding of the book that we read. Perhaps the author has written quite a difficult book. And so the authorship, therefore, gives us a picture of how we scientists work. Our job is to understand at a scientific level the workings of the universe through science, the scientific description, the mechanism. And so the doctrine of creation, or understanding of creation, is simply that God is the author of the whole book of creation. God writes everything. He writes every chapter. He writes the chapters that we understand well, and he writes the chapters we don't understand very well. And so our job as scientists is to try and understand the workings, the mechanisms of creation as much as we can. And so that's the aim of biological evolution. Its aim is to try and explain the roots, the basis, the origins of biological diversity as best as we can. And that's what the biological theory is about. Theistic evolution is the reminder it's all part of God's good creation. And so that's what we study as scientists. There's nothing else to study in science except the creation. That's what we do every day of our lives.
I know that these days you had a hectic schedule. Yesterday you had a tedious journey from Chennai to Bangalore. Tomorrow you will have to go to Nagaland. Then today all day you are taking wonderful classes and sessions. In spite of that, you were kind enough to spend your valuable time to enlighten us. I know that these questions are very simple questions, but with a pastoral concern, I tried to ask these questions, and you gave very enlightening, encouraging answers. We are extremely grateful to each one of you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Well, it's our privilege and joy to be with you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have fellowship and have this discussion.
Thank you.